Hello, hello. Welcome to Reading the Times for Thursday, November 4th, 2021. Thursday, November 4th, 2021. We were doing these live. There's no reason to do them live. I'm not interacting with the public right now. Anyways, the funniest thing, not so funny, but it's interesting. I did yesterday's, Wednesdays. I'm catching up to Monday. Monday's tomorrow. So I have this one and then Friday and then Monday. Within this next week, we'll be caught up to the same day. And YouTube, I didn't know if YouTube recorded it. So then I recorded Wednesdays over again. Well, actually, YouTube says it lost the recording. So I recorded Wednesdays over again. And now I erased what wasn't coming up for YouTube. And then, anyway, somehow YouTube found the recording. So I have two for Wednesday, November 3rd. I did it live. YouTube says that the live messed up. So then I did it again, not live. I uploaded it. And then I went back to YouTube and when I erased the mess up, all of a sudden the old video was found. So now I have two for Wednesday. So I read that twice. Wednesday, November 3rd, I read twice. If you listen to both those videos, it's me reading Wednesday, November 3rd, New York Times twice. But what I did is in one of the videos, I try to remember what I said in the other video. So go figure. It's an experiment. This is all an experiment. But we're going to stop doing them live now. I'm recording them. So that way also yeah, I'll already have them in my record. So anyways, that was a lesson from that example. Record them, then do them, post them. So if there's an error, we could just repost it as opposed to possibly having to do it all over again. This one's going to be a long one, less commentary because it'll be an hour and a half just by itself alone. Let's go. And then tomorrow's Monday. This is Sunday. So tomorrow and Monday we'll do Fridays and we'll do Mondays and we'll be all caught up. And then I just have to start summarizing them, which is a whole nother set of jobs. All right. Reeling from surprise losses, Democrats sound the alarm for 2022. Just as jarring for Democrats were some of the less prominent contests. The powerful New Jersey State Senate President Steve Sweeney was trailing a truck driver who ran a shoestring campaign. A Latino Republican flipped a Democratic seat in South San Antonio, and Democrats were thrashed in local races across Long Island, while Democrat strengths in cities and some large suburbs saved them from even deeper losses. Their electoral coalition showed signs of fraying as voters vented their unhappiness with the party in power. Responding to Tuesday's results like an alarm bell in the night, Democrats on the ballot next year said that unless Mr. Biden and other party leaders addressed voters closer to home frustrations, they were certain to lose their congressional majorities. Many progressive Democrats believe that the only way the party can appeal to voters next year is to deliver for them a range of accomplishments aimed at improving their quality of life. His aides have repeatedly briefed members of Congress on plans to trumpet the country's recovery before the midterm election and educate voters about how the Democrats' initiatives have improved their lives. The Richmond-based Democrat blamed his party's nominee for governor, Terry McAuliffe, not only for failing to engage restive voters, but also for a particularly harmful sin of commission. Murphy narrowly wins re-election as New Jersey governor. Philip D. Murphy, a New Jersey Democrat whose aggressive approach to controlling the pandemic became a focal point of the bid to unseat him, narrowly held on to the governor's office in an unexpectedly close election that highlighted the stark division over masks and vaccine mandates, even in a liberal-leaning state. For Democrats, who long assumed Mr. Murphy's victory was assured, even as the national electoral picture darkened, the 24 hours after polls closed proved tense. Mr. Citriali, at one point, had a substantial lead. Every public opinion poll throughout the campaign had showed that Mr. Murphy would coast to an easy victory. If you want to be governor of all of New Jersey, you must listen to all of New Jersey. And New Jersey, I hear you, Mr. Murphy said. A former assemblyman made Mr. Murphy's edicts a centerpiece of his campaign, using ads and stump speeches to attack vaccine mandates and mandatory masking in schools, and blaming Mr. Murphy's lockdown orders for hurting small businesses and keeping students out of school for too long. Mr. Murphy appeared to significantly underperform President Biden's 2020 showing in highly educated suburban counties that had favored Democrats in the Trump era, the kind of counties that were central to the Democratic takeover of the House in 2018, including New Jersey. In the end, more voters appeared to support the approach taken by Mr. Murphy, who in his first term established New Jersey as one of the most progressive states in the nation. Republicans seize on schools as a wedge issue to unite the party. After an unexpectedly strong showing on Tuesday night, Republicans are headed into 2022 midterm elections with what they believe will be a highly effective political strategy, capitalizing on the frustrations of suburban parents still reeling from the devastating fallout of pandemic-era schooling. Seizing on education as a newly potent wedge issue, Republicans have moved to galvanize crucial groups of voters around what the party calls parental rights issues in public schools, a hodgepodge of conservative causes ranging from eradicating masks, mandates, to demanding changes in the way children are taught about racism. At the same time, Mr. Youngkin and other Republicans tapped into broader dissatisfaction among moderate voters about teachers' unions, unresponsive school boards, quarantine policies, and the instruction parents saw firsthand during months of remote learning. 4 weeks before the Virginia election, Republicans pointed to the school strategy as a possible template for the entire party. Ms. Weingarten blamed Mr. Akolov's defeat on his comment they did not believe parents should be telling schools what they should teach, but she also chided Democrats for their timidity, warning that tough conversations were needed to rebuild trust between parents and their schools. There's a level of anxiety and anger and people wanting to have their lives back, said Ms. Weingarten, who faced blowback for hosting a town hall event in September with Open Schools USA, a group that opposes mask and vaccine mandates in schools. Justice's question suggests New York gun control laws unlikely to survive. So why do you have to show, in this case, convince somebody that you're entitled to exercise your Second Amendment right? At the same time, the Chief Justice was among the justices who asked whether guns could be barred at settings as varied as subways, protests, Yankee Stadium, Times Square on New Year's Eve, and college campuses in New York City. Justice Elena Kagan responded that most people think that Chicago is like the worst city with respect to gun violence. Justice Brett M. Kavanaugh said the court should limit its ruling to what he called the permitting regime. We don't have all the answers to all the sensitive places questions. We don't have to answer all the sensitive places questions in this case, some of which will be challenging, no doubt, he said. The Chief Justice asked how many muggings take place in the forest. Justice Samuel A. Alito asked whether people who work late in Manhattan, it might be somebody who cleans offices, it might be a doorman at an apartment, it might be a nurse or an orderly, it might be somebody who washes dishes, would be granted a license if they said they had a dangerous commute through a high crime area. So I'm not sure how to deal with history. Justice Kavanaugh said that the solution was to start with the text of the Second Amendment, which speaks of the right to keep and bear arms, suggesting that bearing arms happens outside the home. Chief Justice Roberts asked Mr. Clement whether states could say, "You're not allowed to carry on a university campus." He said, "I think the answer to your question is yes." Justice Kagan seemed to think that it was an important concession. Mr. Clement responded to laughter that NYU doesn't have much of a campus. Justice Kagan disagreed, as did Justice Breyer. ISIS poses a growing threat to new Taliban government in Afghanistan. For the Taliban movement he served under, now the government of Afghanistan, the war against the Islamic State was just beginning. In the 2 months since the Taliban took control of the country, the Islamic State affiliate in Afghanistan, known as Islamic State Khorasan or ISIS-K, has stepped up attacks across the country, straining the new and untested government and raising alarm bells in the West about potential resurgence of a group that could eventually pose an international threat. Colin Kahl, U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, told lawmakers last week that the Taliban's ability to pursue the group is to be determined. Mr. Khan's sentiment underlined the core concern of Western intelligence communities. There is little way to measure the Taliban's effectiveness against ISIS-K. There is no longer reliable access to intelligence, as limited drone flights provide piecemeal information given the distance they have to fly just to get to Afghanistan, according to U.S. officials, and the established network of informants has collapsed. The Taliban, who have refused to cooperate with the United States in countering the Islamic State, instead are fighting a war on their own terms, with tactics and strategies that look far more localized than a government campaign against a terror organization. As the Taliban seek international recognition, the group has used the resurgence of the terrorist group as a bargaining chip for more financial aid and, according to Qatari officials, reminding other countries that a powerful Islamic State poses a threat to them as well. Dr. Basir, the head of the Taliban intelligence arm in Jalalabad, who goes by one name, is one of the group's leaders adapting to fighting a war he was once on the other side of as a Taliban insurgent. Just 1 second. We're going to pause. We're going to come right back. That's the other good thing about not doing this live is I could pause. I could come right back. One more. Okay, so we had to take a little break there. We're coming back to finish off Thursday, November 4th, reading the Times. ISIS poses a growing threat to the new Taliban government. That's what we just did. On to the next one. From BTS to Squid Game, how South Korea became a cultural juggernaut. In the same way South Korea borrowed from Japan and the United States to develop its manufacturing prowess, the country's directors and producers say they've been studying Hollywood and other entertainment hubs for years, adopting and refining formulas by adding distinctly Korean touches. 3 of the 10 most popular TV shows on Netflix as of Monday were South Korean. In September, the Oxford English Dictionary added 26 new words of Korean origin, including Hallyu, or Korean wave. South Korean censors screen media for content deemed violent or sexually explicit, but Netflix shows are subject to less stringent restrictions than those broadcast on local TV networks. One dominating feature of Korean content is its combativeness, said Lim Myung-mook, author of a book about Korean youth culture. The show's supernatural plot recalls American TV favorites like X-Files and Stranger Things. Yet Mr. Jang has created a uniquely Korean tragedy centered on Eopbo, a belief among Koreans that both good and bad deeds affect a person in the afterlife. All right. Ethiopia's leaders vow to bury this enemy even as rebels advance. The final report stopped short of saying which side had committed the most atrocities, and rights groups protested that it engaged in false equivocacies, appearing to equate the atrocities committed by Tigrayan forces, mostly in the early weeks of the fight, with a far greater number of serious crimes by Ethiopian forces and allies over the next 8 months. Ms. Bachelet denied that her team had been swayed by the Ethiopian government, whose federal human rights body jointly investigated and wrote the report. The report stands for itself. I can say it was done very seriously. Human Rights Watch welcomed the report, but said it was not an exhaustive account of wartime atrocities in Ethiopia, and that a more thorough, independent inquiry was needed. While most accounts of atrocities in Tigray have focused on Ethiopia and Eritrean troops and their allies, the UN report also lays out stark abuses by Tigrayan forces, although the report does not quantify the scale or proportion of atrocities committed by either side. In other words, who bore greater blame. Ms. Bachelet, during a news briefing, did point to Eritrean and Ethiopian troops. The report fails to identify individual perpetrators, and Ethiopia's judicial system has a poor record in bringing such cases to light. My name is Cleo, girl 14, found 18 days after vanishing from campsite. The girl, Cleo Smith, was freed after the police broke into the empty house in Carnarvon,
the same town where she and her family lived. On Wednesday afternoon, the police released a photo of Cleo smiling and sitting in a hospital bed. The authorities had offered a reward of 1 million Australian dollars for information leading to Cleo. The police said it was unlikely that the reward would be claimed because it was a combination of factors, not a single lead, that had led to Cleo's rescue. The last time Cleo was seen, around 1:30 a.m. the next day, when she asked her mother for a glass of water, the police said. It was when she asked her mother for a glass of water, the police said. Late last night, they found that needle that led them to the address and rescued Cleo. When she said, "My name is Cleo, I don't think there was a dry eye in the house," he said. A Chinese tennis star accused a former top leader of sexual assault. Just having a little coffee here. Peng Shui, the professional tennis star, publicly accused a former vice premier of China of sexual assault, igniting an online firestorm of attention to a Me Too allegation that, for the first time, touched the pinnacle of Communist Party power. Ms. Peng made the accusation in a post on Tuesday night on her verified account on Weibo, China's version of Twitter. Searches of her name and even the word tennis appear to be blocked, reflecting the extraordinary sensitivity within China of discussing misconduct by party leaders. As vice premier from 2013 to 2018, he was one of 7 members of the Politburo Standing Committee, headed then, as now, by China's leader Xi Jinping. In China, many women say there remains an ingrained patriarchal tradition of using positions in business or government to gain sexual favors from subordinates or other women. Ms. Zhao, who in 2018 accused a prominent television anchor of sexual harassment 4 years earlier, emerged as a trailblazer of China's fledgling Me Too movement, and also a victim of the social and legal challenges women who come forward face. Video footage showed at least one child near site minutes before drone strike in Kabul. Surveillance video showed the presence of at least one child in the area some 2 minutes before the military launched a drone strike on a site in Kabul, Afghanistan in August, the Defense Department said on Wednesday. The general blamed a series of assumptions made over the course of 8 hours as U.S. officials tracked a white Toyota Corolla through Kabul for causing what he called confirmation bias, leading to the August 29 strike. Planners involved in the strike had a genuine belief that there was an imminent threat to U.S. forces, the general said. Defense Secretary Lloyd J. Austin III ordered the review of the military's initial inquiry into the drone strike to determine, among other issues, who should be held accountable and the degree to which strike authorities, procedures, and processes need to be altered in the future. Almost everything senior defense officials asserted in the hours, days, and weeks after the drone strike turned out to be false. The Pentagon offered unspecified condolence payments to the family of the 10 civilians, including 7 children, who were killed in the August 29 strike. The Pentagon's initial acknowledgement of the mistaken strike came a week after a New York Times investigation of video evidence challenged assertions by the military that it had struck a vehicle carrying explosives for the airport. U.S. blacklist Israeli firm NSO Group over spyware. In remarkable breach with Israel over one of its most successful technology companies, the Biden administration on Wednesday blacklisted the NSO Group, saying the company knowingly supplied spyware that had been used by foreign governments to maliciously target the phones of dissidents, human rights activists, journalists, and others. NSO spyware has been under scrutiny for years for its ability to stealthily and remotely extract sound and video recordings, encrypted communications, photos, contacts, location data, and text messages from a device without so much as a single click. After a consortium of media outlets reported over the summer that NSO spyware may have targeted smartphones belonging to journalists and world leaders from France, Morocco, and elsewhere, a group of House Democrats called for NSO Group to be blacklisted and potentially sanctioned for human rights violations. NSO said it only sells its spyware to governments whose human rights records have been vetted for the purpose of countering terrorism and crime. Some of NSO's targets, like Ahmed Mansour, a critic of the United Arab Emirates, have been imprisoned and held in solitary confinement for years after NSO's spyware was found on their phones. Apple has patched its iOS software several times to mitigate vulnerabilities exploited by NSO's spyware. Weapons tracing study implicates Russia in Ukraine conflict. A study of weapons and ammunition used in the war in Ukraine shows that Russia has been systematically fanning the conflict with arms shipments, according to a new report funded by the European Union and the German government. The study is hardly the first to reach this conclusion. The United States and European countries have sanctioned Russia for years for arms transfers for separatist forces they say Moscow is supporting in the Ukraine. While unlikely to challenge the overall picture, it offered a fine-grained view of illicit weapon transfers in Ukraine and illustrated the scope of the arms trade that is fueling Europe's only active war. Just finish off my coffee real quick. Titled Weapons of War in Ukraine, the report said that the separatist forces are more than militias armed with weapons inherited from the former Soviet Union. Rather, they mimic modern armies and follow established military doctrine. The war, fought along about a 280-mile-long trench line that cuts through the flatlands of eastern Ukraine, began after street protesters deposed a pro-Russian Ukrainian president in 2014. The study looked at largely small arms, the most basic but most lethal weapons in war, even when more sophisticated armaments are being used, as in the case of Ukraine. The study traced 4,793 rounds of small arm ammunition and 43 weapons recovered from battlefields from 2017 to 2019. China could have 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030, the Pentagon says. China is continuing to strengthen its strategic nuclear arsenal and could have 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030, according to a new Defense Department report released Wednesday. The Pentagon's annual report to Congress on China's military might estimates that China could have 700 deliverable nuclear warheads by 2027 and 1,000 3 years later. China has about 350 nuclear warheads, the organization said. China, General Milley said on Wednesday, is clearly challenging us regionally, and their aspirations is to challenge us globally. He added they have a China dream, and they want to challenge the so-called liberal rules-based order. Asked if the United States could match China's hypersonic capability, General Milley declined to answer. Such a decision by any American president would be a huge shift, since the United States for decades has followed a policy of strategic ambiguity. That leaves open the question of whether the United States would back Taiwan in a military conflict with China. China's most recent defense strategy, released in 2019, said it would keep its nuclear capabilities at the minimal level required for national security. Beijing has also vowed not to use nuclear weapons first or against any non-nuclear state. Climate Summit turns its focus to a contentious question: who pays? Some of the world's biggest financial institutions on Wednesday vowed to mobilize trillions of dollars to help shift the global economy toward cleaner energy, as negotiations at the United Nations Climate Summit struggled with questions on how to pay for enormous costs of climate change. We now have the essential plumbing in place to move climate change from the fringe to the forefront of finances, so that every financial decision takes climate change into account, said Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England, who is leading the coalition, along with billionaire and former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg. A decade ago, the world's wealthiest countries pledged $100 billion per year in climate aid and by 2020 to help poor countries transition to cleaner energy and protect themselves against the growing dangers from heat waves, flood, drought, and wildfires as the planet warms. Climate Forward, a new administration, an ongoing climate emergency, and tons of news. Mr. Brown noted that even as the world's richest countries have failed to meet their promises on climate finance, major economies have spent roughly $3.3 trillion since 2015 subsidizing fossil fuel production and consumption, according to one recent study. Accelerating climate transition in developing countries will not happen if an immediate 20% return on every investment is necessary, Mr. Shah said. Carbon dioxide emissions rebound sharply after pandemic dip. After a drastic decline last year, global fossil fuel emissions have rebounded sharply in 2021 and are now just slightly below their previous record highs, researchers said Wednesday. In 2021, emissions are projected to rise 4.9%, as the global economy has rumbled back to life and lockdowns have mostly eased. Overall, global emissions are now less than 1% below their previous highs in 2019, suggesting that any climate impact from the pandemic was fleeting. The new emissions numbers were released during a major United Nations climate summit in Glasgow, where world leaders are discussing how to accelerate efforts to tackle climate change, proposing new measures to protect forests and curb emissions of methane. We might have seen emissions snap back this year in any case, since it's tough to completely change the global energy system in a single year. But we could have set ourselves up much better for future years. The analysts did include some slightly good news when emissions from land use and deforestation are included. It appears that global carbon dioxide emissions have stayed more or less flat over the past decade after a rapid increase during the early 2000s, suggesting that nations are slowly making progress in bending the emission curve. In order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, a threshold many scientists say is necessary to avoid the worst effects from heat wave, droughts, wildfire, and flooding, emissions would have to fall on average 1.4 billion tons every single year between now and 2050. For progressives, Michelle Wu points to a way forward. In Tuesday's election, Ms. Wu trounced a more moderate opponent, City Councilor Anissa Essayebe George, by a 28-point margin. Still flushed from her victory, Ms. Wu affirmed her plan to make the city into a laboratory for progressive policy, the kind she studied under her mentor, Senator Elizabeth Warren. We are the city of the first public school in the country, the first public park, the first subway tunnel. We are the city of revolution, civil rights, marriage equality. We have always been the city that punches above our weight. Ms. Wu's campaign, and particularly her years of infrastructure building and engagement, should be a model for progressive candidates across the country, said Adam Green, co-founder of the Progressive Change Campaign Committee, which endorsed her. Over her 4 terms as city councilor, Bostonians have gotten to know Ms. Wu as a soft-spoken and thoughtful, intensely focused on policy, meticulous about showing up at meetings and returning phone calls. The demographics of Boston are changing rapidly, with young professionals drawn to the city for jobs in technology, medicine, and education. Boston has become an intellectually elite city, said Nan Whaley, the mayor of Dayton, Ohio, and the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Boston might be a harbinger for the situation in our big cities. A Republican narrowly flipped a state house seat in San Antonio. I don't think you can buy values. I voted for the issues I care about, not about who's from what party. Mr. Shigoi's vote helped flip a once reliably Democratic bastion by 286 ballots in a runoff for a special election. After none of the 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans who ran in the special election in September received a majority of votes, Mr. Lujan delivered a seat critical to Republican efforts to make inroads with Latino voters, who not long ago tended to favor Democrats. In last year's presidential election, 56% of voters in the 118th district supported President Biden, and 42% picked Donald J. Trump. Latino voters have begun to move away from the Democratic Party, with Mr. Biden's approval rating at about 50% among the demographic, according to a recent poll. The Associated Republicans of Texas, a group that backed Mr. Lujan, said on Twitter that Mr. Lujan's gain set the tone for the Republicans. We continue to reach out to Hispanic voters in South Texas communities to pick up more seats in 2022. On Tuesday night, Governor Greg Abbott and Dade Phelan, the Speaker of the House, both called Mr. Lujan to congratulate him, a clear sign that they were happy with their strategy. Moments after garnering a majority of the votes on Tuesday night, Mr. Lujan echoed that sentiment. Ballot initiatives to increase House won big on Tuesday, a possible harbinger for 2022. A slew of initiatives aimed at addressing the nation's housing crisis passed on Tuesday, a test run for ballot choices in 2022 as more cities and states take aim at rising rents, a continued explosion in short-term rentals, and the depressed housing stock nationwide. The epicenter of the action was in the West, particularly in Colorado, where housing prices have skyrocketed in recent years, with short-term rentals helping lead the way. In Leadville, a scenic former silver mining town, voters overwhelmingly approved a new 3% tax on visitors staying in hotels, motels, and short-term rentals, which will be used to create more affordable housing. Measures to increase fees on short-term rentals passed in Telluride, Avon, and Ouray. Vail approved a sales tax increase for housing. In Albuquerque, voters approved new bonds that would finance the construction and rehabilitation of low and moderate income housing. As housing availability decreases and housing costs increase in cities, especially big cities across many states, voters will continue to see more housing-related measures on the ballot, said John Altick, the ballot measure project director at Ballotpedia. After celebrating the U.S. abroad, Biden returns to challenge it at home. President Biden on Wednesday returned from his second trip abroad since taking office, aiming to celebrate the return of U.S. leadership on the global stage, and hoping for Democratic victories in key elections in Virginia and New Jersey. The results in Virginia and New Jersey exposed the party's limitations in relying on anti-Trump sentiment to galvanize voters, and they also highlighted a growing concern for Democrats and the White House, the failure to pass Mr. Biden's agenda or make good on his campaign promise of overcoming the coronavirus pandemic fueled dissatisfaction. Black voters who supported Mr. Biden are also waiting to see progress on other issues like police reform and voting rights, said Quentin James, founder of Collective PAC, an organization dedicated to electing African American officials. We asked the entire country to show up to vote last year. We gave the Democrats the House, the Senate, and the White House, the presidency, and people are questioning now, what have they done with that, he said. While his legislation is pending, Mr. Biden and other Democrats will also need to develop a more effective message to voters, including a response to Republicans who tapped into the white grievance politics of the Trump base by focusing on how the history of racism is taught in schools, Mr. James said. The election outcomes on Tuesday showed that Mr. Biden will need to address not just the potential impact of his sweeping policies, but also issues that are currently animating voters, Mr. Axelrod said. Youngkin's dance with Trump was pivotal, but is it repeatable? In the spring, during the Republican nominating contest in Virginia, Mr. Youngkin echoed Mr. Trump's false claim of election fraud. Mr. Youngkin spent $20 million of his own money to subsidize television ads, portraying him as a from-the-bootstraps business success, clad in campaign logo fleece vests that cemented his image as a suburban dad. Weeks later, Mr. McAuliffe began airing his own ads, attacking Mr. Youngkin as a Trump acolyte. The two sides worked to arrange Mr. Trump's tele-rally on the eve of the election, according to an aide to Mr. Youngkin. But there's no coordination on what the former president would say. Mr. Fredericks, the radio host who is friendly with both Mr. Youngkin and Mr. Trump, credited Mr. Youngkin with refraining from adopting a combative Trump style while embracing issues critical to the Trump base, including some white voters' concerns over how the racial history of America is taught in school. Virginia's Republicans attributed their success less to Mr. Trump's sideline cheering for Mr. Youngkin and more to an environment fueled by disenchantment with the Biden administration, anger that the coronavirus pandemic shows few signs of receding, and an economy that has seen rising prices for gasoline, among other household staples. We spend a lot of money and time and effort trying to turn out Trump disengagers, people who voted for Trump in 2016 and didn't show up after that, said John Whitbeck, a former chairman of the Republican Party of Virginia. Rough night for Democrats exposes the party's weakness. Perhaps most strikingly, the crushing setbacks for the Democrats in heavily suburban Virginia and New Jersey hinted at a conservative-stoked backlash to the changing mores around race and identity championed by the party, as Republicans relentlessly sought to turn schools into the next front in the country's culture wars. In the coming days, Democrats' anxieties and recriminations over the party's loss in Virginia, the marquee race of the off-year elections, will echo from those suburban swing districts to Capitol Hill, as the midterm map extends into areas once considered safer for Democrats. The Democrats need to take a serious look at how we choose to engage with the Trump narrative, said Dan Cena, Democratic strategist who helped the party win the House in 2018. Even before the Virginia race tightened in late August, the national environment looked inauspicious for Democrats, who may lose seats in redistricting and face a historical trend of a presidential party losing seats during his first term in office. Yet self-preservation remains one of the most powerful forces in politics, leaving many strategists pessimistic that the party will unify around a central approach as Democrats in competitive midterm races grow increasingly nervous. Mr. McAuliffe's campaign maintained that even out of office, the former president remained Democrats' most powerful weapon in a race widely expected to hinge on which party could best motivate its base. Glenn Youngkin's journey from the heights of finance to top tier of GOP politics. After a remarkable upset in the race for governor of Virginia, Mr. Youngkin is the newest star of the Republican Party, whose campaign will be reverse engineered for its lesson by both parties, and whose political future may hardly be limited to 4 years in the cream-colored executive mansion in Richmond. A natural campaigner running his first race, Mr. Youngkin found a way to enlist both Republican base still enthralled to Donald J. Trump and less ideological Republicans who rejected the party in the Trump era. His victory, running as a conservative and seemingly Democratic redoubt, no Republican has won statewide Virginia in a dozen years, could make Mr. Youngkin, 54, a contender within his party nationally, if its voters decide they are ready to move from Mr. Trump and Trumpism. A private foundation that the Youngkins established owns property in McLean that is the site of Holy Trinity Church, an independent evangelical congregation that Mr. Youngkin first founded in his basement, and a 358-acre farm in Middleburg, horse country, that serves as a Christian retreat ministry. In interviews, Mr. Youngkin explained that it was Suzanne who had made him a regular churchgoer, insisting that faith be central to their marriage. For more than a decade, Mr. Youngkin has been a generous donor to establishment Republicans, including Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina and former Speaker Ryan Paul, as well as Mitt Romney, the 2012 Republican presidential nominee, who benefited from $75,000 of Mr. Youngkin's cash. In a crowded Republican primary field, with most candidates vying for a Trump base that largely believed in the falsehood that the 2020 election was stolen because of fraud, Mr. Youngkin made election integrity his top issue. Here are 5 takeaways from the election results. Glenn Youngkin, a Republican business executive, marched to victory in Tuesday's election, delivering his party's governorship of Virginia and highlighting a strong night for Republicans less than a year after voters pushed them fully out of power in the nation's capital. The outcome in Virginia, combined with an unexpectedly close contest in New Jersey, where Democratic governor barely won re-election, delivered a jolt of encouragement for Republicans and stark warning sign for the Democrats less than 10 months into President Biden's term. Mr. Youngkin pulled off something of a surprise and a rare feat. He drove up the Republican margins in white and rural parts of the state further than Mr. Trump had, cutting into the edge of the Democratic nominee, former Governor Terry McAuliffe, in suburban areas. To the extent that the Youngkin victory provided a fresh GOP blueprint, the surprisingly strong showing in New Jersey by the Republican candidate, Jack Ciattarelli, was only narrowly defeated by Governor Philip D. Murphy, a Democrat, made plain that the political environment had seriously degraded for Democrats nationally. Because Mr. Biden carried Virginia by 10 percentage points in 2020, a Youngkin victory represents a Republican improvement of more than 10 percent points in exactly 1 year. Just as worrisome for the Democrats is that of the 36 governorships up for grabs in 2022, 8 are now held by Democrats in states that had a similar Democratic margin of victory in 2020 than Virginia, according to an election memo for donors from the Republican Governors Association. We need policemen. Even in liberal cities, voters reject scaled-back policing. Given the opportunity Tuesday to dismantle their city's troubled police department and replace it with something new, Minneapolis voters said no. In New York City, Eric Adams, a former police captain who won the Democratic primary this year, after rejecting the defund the police movement and emphasizing the role of the police in public safety, sailed to election. In Minneapolis, Mayor Jacob Frey, who oversaw the city where Mr. Floyd was killed, and was heckled by demonstrators after bucking calls to abolish the police department, decisively won a second term. The results in Minneapolis, where a proposed amendment would have replaced the police department with a new agency focused on public health, showed how strongly held views that policing needs to change clashed with concerns about rising gun violence and homicides. In Seattle, another liberal city that saw large, sometimes destructive protests in 2020, the Republican candidate for city attorney, Ann Davison, was leading in the vote over an opponent who had posted messages about her hatred of the police and sought to abolish the criminal justice system as it exists. In the mayor's race, Mr. Harrell, a Democrat who had criticized the defund effort and was leading, said on Wednesday that voters wanted improvements in policing, but also wanted a police force that could respond to crimes quickly and conduct thorough investigations. NY Democrats assess losses to Republicans. This was a shellacking. New York Democrats were left reeling on Wednesday after startling electoral losses from the tip of Long Island to the shores of Lake Erie, as a re-energized Republican Party showed it could make deep inroads even in one of the country's liberal strongholds. In New York City, where Eric Adams and his fellow Democrats easily retained control of City Hall and the City Council, Republicans were nonetheless poised to expand their presence in city government after another low-turnout election, possibly to levels not seen since Rudolph W. Giuliani was mayor. The results for Democrats were no better on statewide ballots measures, as voters soundly rejected two constitutional amendments meant to broaden ballot access, a major national priority for the party that Democrats had believed would sail to approval. The results across New York mirrored damaging outcomes for Democrats in governor's races in Virginia, where Republicans won, and New Jersey, where they came close, and signaled that even traditional blue bastions and suburbs that leaned Democrat during Mr. Trump's presidency were not immune to a punishing national environment. Republicans were energized because they're angry and they're unhappy with the direction of the country. We saw that in polls. Democrats are disheartened and unenthusiastic. Republicans, on the other hand, emerged buoyant on Wednesday, promising to compound their gains next year, when New York will elect a governor, attorney general, and state legislature. Peter King, a former longtime Republican congressman from Long Island, characterized the results overall as a reaction against Biden and the progressive Democrats. He warned that his party could still squander its good hand, particularly if it campaigned in what he cast as an overall overly ideological manner. India Walton says she's unlikely to beat the write-in incumbent Byron Brown in the Buffalo mayor's race. In a sharp reversal of political fortune, Mayor Byron W. Brown of Buffalo has seemingly triumphed in a write-in campaign for a new term, besting India Walton, a Democratic socialist who had stunned Mr. Brown in a primary in June and had drawn national attention as a champion of progressive values. Mr. Brown, 63, had declared victory late Tuesday as ballots rolled in and became apparent that write-in would carry the day, with all precincts reporting just over 40% of votes were for Ms. Walton and 59% were marked for write-in, a margin of about 10,000 votes. While Mr. Brown's campaign overcame hurdles, Ms. Walton carried the Democratic line and was the only candidate whose name was printed on the ballot. Repairing his reputation as a Democrat in good standing may be more difficult with the more insurgent wing of his party. In an interview Wednesday, a buoyant Mr. Brown said his write-in campaign was born in the moments after his stunning defeat in June, where he ran a lackluster campaign. The apparent win for Mr. Brown, a centrist and lifelong Democrat, is a stinging rebuke for the left wing of the party, both nationally and in New York, which had celebrated Ms. Walton's unlikely win in June, with volunteers and prominent backers flocking to her campaign in recent months. Mr. Brown rallied a coalition of conservatives and moderate supporters, as well as enjoying the backing of several prominent labor unions and independent expenditure groups funded by real estate, which has seen a revival in Buffalo under Mr. Brown. Eric Adams vows to get stuff done, but first, a night on the town. After a decade of plotting his path to become mayor of New York City, Eric Adams won a decisive victory on Tuesday. "I'm going to be a mayor that is going to be a GSD mayor, get stuff done, Mr. Adams said on MSNBC. In a phone interview late on Wednesday, he re-emphasized his campaign commitment to improving public safety, citing 2 examples of what get stuff done would look like in his first 100 days. How do we move our city forward? Mr. Adams said on MSNBC on Wednesday morning, adding, I'm going to build those bridges and not blow those bridges up. Mr. Adams, who understands how much of a mayor's agenda depends on Albany, from school funding to the subway revival, has already showed his political savvy by having Governor Kathy Hochul, a fellow Democrat who faces a primary challenger next year, speak at his election night party. Another major unknown is who will be the next city council speaker, a powerful role in New York City government, and whether Mr. Adams will seek to influence the wide-open contest for the job. During his victory speech, Mr. Adams hinted at his flaws, but said he would work hard to move the city in a new direction. Because I'm perfectly imperfect. Mr. Adams will also clearly offer a different style than Mr. de Blasio, who is not known to delight in the city's cultural events. With Cuomo gone, Hochul revises plan for Penn Station. Ms. Hochul said that the renovation of Penn Station and construction of new towers could move forward without the track and infrastructure upgrades and without jeopardizing future funding for them, though details on exactly how that would work were thin. Aides to Ms. Hochul said that she wanted the project to benefit New Yorkers first and foremost, directing state agencies to focus on the new Penn Station and new public amenities. It's time for a Penn Station that meets the needs of New Yorkers, Ms. Hochul said at a news conference Wednesday. At 18.3 million square feet, the new Penn Station project will be slightly larger than Hudson Yards, the mega site of offices, residences, and retail that opened in 2019 as the largest private development in American history. Gateway's second phase includes the plan to add more tracks to Penn Station, an expansion that was part of Mr. Cuomo's vision for what he called the Empire Station Complex. Ms. Hochul sees an above-ground overhaul of Penn Station as benefiting New Yorkers more than other recent transportation projects, like Moynihan train station, which serves Amtrak customers at Penn Station, or the Lower Manhattan transportation hub known as Oculus. What New York and the region needs is a renovated Penn Station, an expanded Penn Station, and the tunnels to be built. Democrats, stung by losses, press forward on the Biden agenda. Smarting from an off-year election rebuke, the congressional Democrats pushed forward on Wednesday toward House votes as soon as Thursday on nearly $3 trillion worth of social policy, infrastructure, and climate change programs, but with a deep new worry. Would a legislative victory help or hurt their bruised political standing? The day after a defeat in Virginia's governor race and an unexpectedly close race in the Democratic stronghold of New Jersey, the Democrats in Congress toiled to keep recrimination to a minimum. Virtually all Democrats came away from the sweeping defeats in Virginia and a narrow escape for New Jersey's Democratic governor race, Philip D. Murphy, agreeing that the imperative now was to pass both bills as quickly as possible to prove they were a party that could govern. Because automatically there's a 30-second spot against Democrats. In the wake of the elections, Republicans hunted for fissures in the Democratic caucus that could sink the social policy bill. Glenn Youngkin ran on education, and he won on education. Democrats appeared confident that they could weather that line of attack by emphasizing that benefits of the programs created by their legislation, against which Republicans are united in opposition. Some lawmakers said Americans would notice once they delivered on Mr. Biden's agenda. But Senator Mazie K. Hirono, Democrat of Hawaii, said Democrats needed to get better at touting their accomplishments. What are the Republicans doing? Nothing. Zero. Zilch. Before they can promote their achievements, Democrats need to pass some bills. Republicans block a second voting rights bill in the Senate. Senate Republicans on Wednesday blocked legislation to restore parts of the landmark Voting Rights Act weakened by Supreme Court rulings, making it the second major voting bill to be derailed by a GOP filibuster in the past 2 weeks. Despite receiving majority support, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, named for the civil rights activist and congressman who died last year, fell 9 votes short of the 60 required to advance over Republican opposition. We will continue to fight for voting rights and find an alternative path forward. Before the vote, according to a senior Democratic aide, Mr. Schumer convened a meeting with moderate Democratic senators to strategize over the next move on voting rights and how to proceed with family discussions to find a way around the Republican opposition. The John Lewis measure is distinct from an earlier voting rights measure, the Freedom to Vote Act, which Republicans have thrice thwarted through filibusters, most recently in October. Speaking before Senate Republicans blocked a second voting rights bill, Senator Mitch McConnell, the minority leader, said the Democrats were trying to give preemptive authority of voting law changes. Preemptive authority of voting law changes to the Attorney General that should be handled by state and local governments. We cannot let a Senate procedure stop us from protecting the rights to vote in the United States of America. In a statement, Mr. Biden did not mention the filibuster, but suggested that voting rights had a special status and that protecting them was paramount. Lawmakers are asking Biden to rescind medals for Wounded Knee massacre. More than a dozen members of Congress have called on President Biden to use his executive authority to revoke medals of honor awarded for the killings of members of the Lakota Sioux tribe, including unarmed women and children, at Wounded Knee, South Dakota, in the 19th century. As the soldiers were disarming the Lakota, a shot was fired. Then the soldiers attacked. In the aftermath, the government looked into the conduct of the troops of the 7th Cavalry and decided to award the medals, the nation's highest military commendation, to the soldiers involved. To date, the nation has awarded more than 3,500 medals of honor, including about 400 to soldiers who fought in campaigns against Native Americans. No medals awarded for service in battle against Native Americans have been revoked. Ms. Warren, Senator Jeff Merkley, Democrat from Oregon, and Representative Kai Kahele, a Democrat of Hawaii, led the reintroduction of the Remove the Stain Act, a bill that would revoke medals of honor from 20 United States soldiers who took part in the massacre at Wounded Knee. Biden rejects $450,000 of payments for separated migrants. President Biden on Wednesday said migrants separated from family members at the border would not receive hundreds of thousands of dollars for the damage inflicted by the Trump-era policy, rejecting an option for monetary compensation that has been floated in negotiations with lawyers representing the families. We respectfully remind President Biden that he called these actions criminal in a debate with then-President Trump and campaigned on remedying and rectifying the lawfulness of the Trump administration. Mr. Romero also acknowledged that Mr. Biden may have been caught off guard by the question and may not have been aware of the details of ongoing negotiations with the Justice Department. Asked about the president's comment on Wednesday, Dana Iverson, spokeswoman for the Justice Department, said the department will not comment on ongoing litigation. Mr. Biden said last month that the Justice Department should prosecute those who defy subpoenas from the House Committee investigating the Jan 6 attacks on the Capitol, a comment he later walked back during a CNN town hall. The Biden administration's handling of rising illegal border crossings has received criticism from Democrats and Republicans alike. To contend with the record number of crossings, Mr. Biden has continued to use a Trump-era border policy that rapidly turns away many migrants at the border without providing them a chance to ask for asylum in the United States. The deterrent approach has also prompted a fierce debate within the administration, with some of Biden's top aides favoring strong policies to contain the crossings, while others support a more welcoming stance to make good on the president's campaign pledge of restoring an asylum program at the southwest border. NYC cabbies with millions more in aid. Cabbies win millions more in aid after hunger strike. In all, the city could spend $100 million or more in a bid to potentially eliminate hundreds of millions of dollars in debt they owe by the drivers. In return, the city will give the lender a cash payment of $30,000 for each driver and also guarantee every loan agreeing to repay if the driver ever defaults. The new plan has not yet been adopted by other lenders in the taxi industry, who carry about 60% of the loans taken out by drivers to buy medallions, the tin plates bolted onto the hood of yellow taxis that allow them to pick up street hails. Drivers will no longer be at risk of losing their homes and no longer be held captive to debt beyond their lifetime. said Bharavi Desai, the head of the Taxi Workers Alliance, which said it represents about 20,000 drivers. As the price soared to $1 million, drivers who wanted to own their own cabs instead of working for a taxi fleet took on hefty loans that they could not afford, while lenders pocketed hundreds of millions of dollars, the New York Times reported in a 2019 series. During the bubble, the city exempted the industry from regulations and filled budget gaps by selling new medallions and running ads promoting them as an investment that was better than the stock market. The Taxi Workers Alliance began camping out at City Hall to push for more aid in September, and about a dozen drivers began a hunger strike on October 20th. In the trial over Ahmaud Arbery's killing, a nearly all-white jury is selected. After a grueling process that lasted 2.5 weeks, a jury was selected on Wednesday in the trial of 3 white men accused of killing Ahmaud Arbery, the 25-year-old black man who was chased through a suburban Georgian neighborhood before being fatally shot by one of the pursuers in February 2020. After reviewing the eliminations one by one, Judge Timothy R. Walsme of Glynn County Superior Court acknowledged that quite a few African-American jurors were excused through peremptory strikes executed by the defense. But that doesn't mean, he continued, that the court has the authority to reseat simply again because there's this prima facie case. The judge ruled that for each of the 8 stricken jurors, the defense had provided a legitimate, non-discriminatory, clear, reasonably specific, and related reason as to why the potential juror should not be seated. Inside the Glynn County Courthouse, a red brick building with imposing Ionic columns fronting a park full of moss-covered oaks, lawyers spent days subjecting scores of potential jurors to intense rounds of questions about how much they knew about the case, whether they had formed opinions about the defendant's guilt, and their preferred news source and social media networks. Ms. Dunikowski, the lead prosecutor, said in court that she was hoping for jurors who were a blank slate, but the killing was one of the most notorious in South Georgia in decades, and many prospective jurors, the court system sent out 1,000 jury notices, said they had already formed an opinion about it. On February 23, 2020, Ahmaud Arbery, a 25-year-old black man, was shot and killed after being chased by 3 white men while jogging near his home on the outskirts of Brunswick, Georgia. The slaying of Mr. Arbery was captured in a graphic video that was widely viewed by the public. Annie Dietz, a public defender and adjunct law professor at Emory University and Georgia State University, was not surprised that it had been difficult to find impartial jurors in the Georgia case. We can now see the playbook for overturning Roe v. Wade. SB 8 looked for a while like the kind of Faustian bargain between the Supreme Court's conservative supermajority and state legislators. The justices could all but eliminate abortion access in Texas without inciting the kind of political backlash for conservatives that seems likely to come from openly reversing Roe v. Wade. SB 8 allowed the state to appease these activists by banning abortion well before the point of fetal viability, which is unconstitutional under Roe v. Wade, without the risk of losing in federal court and having to pay attorney's fees. SB 8 is a result of conservatives' decade-long quest for a bulletproof abortion ban, one that's exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to challenge in federal court. The Supreme Court let SB 8 go into effect on September 1st, and then wrote a cryptic order explaining that abortion providers might not have a case that belonged in federal court. If Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Kavanaugh are leaning toward allowing abortion providers to challenge SB 8 in federal court, as it seemed to be on Monday, it will be about politics as much as power. So if the court's conservative justices decide to let abortion providers sue in federal court, that is not necessarily a sign they're going soft on Roe v. Wade. The mystery of Havana syndrome. The memories have resurfaced as I followed the saga of Havana syndrome. The neurological symptoms that American diplomats and spies and Canadians, some Canadians, has started reporting in Cuba in 2016 and have reported in several other places since, most recently Colombia. The symptoms are indisputable and serious. They've included headaches, nausea, impaired balance, and hearing loss. The basic idea is that a reaction to some form of stress or trauma can cause a variety of symptoms that cannot be explained by any other disease or condition. In September, Congress unanimously passed the Helping the American Victims Act by Neurological Attacks Act. They passed the Helping American Victims Afflicted by Neurological Attacks Act. It's the Havana Act. They made it spell Havana, which provides financial support to sufferers of the neurological symptoms. Senator Marco Rubio, a Florida Republican who is the son of Cuban exiles and one of the authors of the bill, dismissed some of those skeptical of the theory that symptoms were caused by directed energy attacks as influence agents who are paid or encouraged by foreign governments or whatever. They don't want to be discussed out. They don't want this to be discussed out there and want to cast doubt on it. The skeptics include many serious scientists, such as Cheryl Rofer, a former chemist at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, who wrote in Foreign Policy that no proponent of the directed energy theory has outlined how such a weapon would work, and that any nation has developed one. The potential ramifications of such a conclusion for Havana syndrome and the indisputable neurological symptoms of the Americans who have suffered from it for several years now demand dispassionate and objective investigation, not speculative bombast. Election Day silver linings. Walking to the polls on Election Day, I suddenly had a vision of all my neighbors trying to break out of the doldrums by voting for Curtis Sliwa for mayor. The winner, Eric Adams, a Democrat, is a former police officer who ran a smooth campaign about his plans for reforming crime fighting in New York. Will you be surprised to hear that Donald Trump is taking credit? The other governor's race in New Jersey was more dramatic than expected, with incumbent Philip Murphy fighting off a surprisingly strong challenge from Republican Jack Ciattarelli, a former assemblyman. I'll bet most New Jersey voters accept the governor's view, however grudgingly. Cincinnati chose an Asian American mayor, and Dearborn, Michigan's next mayor, is going to be an Arab American Muslim. Just ignore the new flood of emails asking you to donate to some worthy candidate's quest for a House seat in 2022. Why Democrats are in trouble. Days before it became clear that Republican Glenn Youngkin would win Virginia's gubernatorial race, pollsters, pundits, and political strategists were trying to explain why a race that was the Democrat Terry McAuliffe's to lose was on its way to being lost. The pro-McAuliffe Lincoln Project even tried to troll a Youngkin event in Charlottesville with tiki torch bearers, but they were exposed. The Republican Chris Christie of New York won a similar bellwether gubernatorial election in 2009, almost a year into Barack Obama's first term. Mr. Youngkin's focus on issues like cutting taxes on groceries and giving parents more of a say in their kids' education. Who's a fake moderate? Biden campaigned as the most centrist Democrat in last year's primary field. No wonder the debate over CRT influenced pedagogies in public schools, which liberals insist don't even exist in the state's public schools, although they clearly do, has such a galvanic effect on the Virginia race. Memo to Republicans, this is how you lose gracefully. It's considered a bellwether for the midterm elections, and Tuesday's vote served as the first major referendum on the Biden era. Speaking on election fraud, the Republicans have been strangely quiet on the topic this time around. This is how so many Republicans managed to keep a straight face in 2020, as they argued that voters for Mr. Biden were fraudulent, even while voters for winning Republican candidates farther down the same ballot were magically untainted. Alas, Republicans these days seem more intent on deflecting criticism than on hearing it. Cue the references to Stacey Abrams, who refused to concede in the 2018 Georgia governor's race after losing to her Republican opponent, Brian Kemp. Republicans should read Mr. McAuliffe's statement and remember why it's so important to lose gracefully. After the elections, worries for Democrats. One overarching theme of Tuesday's election was that President Biden's slumping favorability hurt Democrats countrywide. one of the many explanations being suggested for the election of a Republican as Virginia's governor, and the many suggestions being offered to Democrats as to how they should now proceed. Perhaps these things are worth considering. It appears likely that Virginia voters may have been more concerned with issues like education and the economy than with conducting a referendum on President Biden versus Donald Trump. Undoubtedly, children deserve to have their circumstances that surround their deaths understood, but the adult violence that ended their lives is just the tipping point, the over-reliance of the administration for children's services to ensure that poor children are safe and thriving is based on flawed assumptions, that the broader society is fair, and that correcting the behavior of parents deemed to have failed their children is primary. As we prepare to usher in new mayoral administrations in New York City, let's summon a renewed sense of political will and boldness to holistically advance efforts that truly keep children safe and families thriving. Ms. Miller is a former deputy commissioner at the Administration for Children's Services. Google wants to work with Pentagon again, despite employee concerns. The exact size of the new contract is unknown, although it is half the duration and will be awarded to more than one company, not a single provider like JEDI. It is unclear whether the work, which would provide the Defense Department access to Google's cloud products, would violate Google's AI principles. Although the Defense Department said that the technology is expected to support the military in combat, Google started working on Project Maven in 2017 and prepared to bid for JEDI. Many Google's employees believe Project Maven represented a potentially lethal use of artificial intelligence, and more than 4,000 workers signed a letter demanding that Google withdraw from the project. Several months later, Google said it would not bid on the JEDI contract, although it was unlikely that the government had a shot at landing the deal. Their Maven experience has soured the relationship between Google and the military, and Google lacks some of the security certifications needed to handle the classified data. The principles specifically state Google will not pursue AI that can be applied in weapons or those that direct injury. Lucy Suchman, a professor of anthropology of science and technology at Lancaster University, whose research focuses on the use of technology in war, said that with so much money at stake, it is no surprise Google might waver on its commitment. Google's efforts come as its employees are already pushing the company to cancel a cloud computing contract with the Israeli military called Project Nimbus that provides Google services to government entities throughout Israel. The Defense Department said it planned to reach out to Google, Oracle, and IBM, but Google executives believe they have the capability to compete for the new contract, and the company expects the Defense Department to tell it whether it will qualify to make a bid in the coming weeks, two people familiar with the matter said. A sinking student housing empire. Mr. Nelson has been accused of diverting investor money to shore up other projects. Officials in states from Colorado to Mississippi have investigated his properties for health and safety violations, and students who work in his building say they're missing pay. In 2007, Mr. Nelson launched an earlier student housing operation called Nelson Brothers Property Management with his younger brother, Brian. In the 3 years since they split, Patrick Nelson founded his own business, Nelson Partners, and raised about $100 million from roughly 400 investors, according to filings. And Mr. Nelson, Shane Stone, a former chief financial officer for Nelson Partners, said Mr. Nelson seemed determined to make a big splash after the partnership with his younger brother came apart. A hedge fund, Axonic Capital, gave Nelson Partners $35 million in additional financing to close the sale. According to court documents, Nelson Partners delayed construction on a new housing facility near Utah State University, where Mr. Nelson received a master's degree in business, forcing more than 100 students who had signed leases for the fall semester to scramble for somewhere else to live. European steel plan shows Biden's bid to merge climate and trade policy. The arrangement, which American and European leaders aim to introduce by 2024, would use tariffs or other tools to encourage the production and trade of metals made with fewer carbon emissions in places including the United States and European Union, and block dirtier steel and aluminum produced in countries including China. In the same interview, Catherine Tai, the United States trade representative, said the potential agreement would restrict market access for countries that don't meet certain carbon standards or that engage in non-market practices and contribute to global overcapacity in the steel sector, accusations that are often levied at China. The effort would seek to build a global arrangement that promotes not just fair trade in steel, but also pro-climate and responsible trade in steel. Ms. Tai said, supporters of free trade have criticized the Biden administration for relying on the same protectionist trade measures used by the Trump administration, which deployed both tariffs and quotas to protect domestic metal makers. Jake Colvin, the president of the National Foreign Trade Council, said the announcement would ratchet down trade tensions between the United States and Europe. The administration has rejected Mr. Trump's America First approach to trade, saying the United States needs to work with like-minded countries. What Jerome Powell didn't do: lay the groundwork for higher rates. High inflation is causing economic discontent for Americans, according to surveys, and helping to drag down the president's approval ratings. On interest rates, Mr. Powell rejected the thinking of leaders at several other leading central banks and of a handful of his own colleagues. Several Eastern European central banks are going a step further, aggressively raising rates to try to combat inflation. With hindsight, the Fed may have erred by raising interest rates prematurely, slowing the process of labor market improvement. With his assurances Wednesday that the Fed wasn't in a hurry to raise rates, Mr. Powell was essentially trying to avoid that problem. Mr. Powell said as much by stating the United States could achieve maximum employment, a legally mandated goal by the Fed, by the second half of 2022, which would clear the way for rate increases. Inflation bonds are getting a big rate bump. The new inflation-based rate applies to I-bonds issued from November of this year through next April, as well as to older I-bonds that are still earning interest. Savings bonds generally are low-risk investments, but I-bonds' rate structure is complicated, and there are drawbacks like limits on how much you can buy and penalties if you cash them in early. The rate earned by inflation bonds, which were first issued in 1998, is made up of two parts: a base rate fixed on the life of the bond, and a rate that varies based on inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index, which can reset every 6 months, in May and November. If the bond's inflation rate were to fall, while the fixed rate stayed at zero, the rate paid on the bonds could be less attractive. Holders of bonds issued from May to October 2000 will earn 10.85% because the latest variable inflation rate is added to the bond's fixed rate of 3.6%, said Ken Tuman, founder of DepositAccounts.com. You won't receive a paper bond. Most new savings bonds are electronic and remain in your digital account. The New York Sun, a defunct newspaper, plans a comeback after a sale. The New York Sun, a daily broadsheet that folded in 2008 after a 6-year run, will make an online comeback under new ownership, the paper's founding editor and its new owner said on Wednesday. Seth Lipsky, the editor-in-chief and former owner of The Sun, sold the publication in a cash and stock deal to David Ifyun, who until recently was a top editor of the Algemeiner, a Jewish interest print and online publication based in New York. Mr. Lipsky and Mr. Ifyun said, for The Sun's return, Mr. Lipsky will remain the top editor and Mr. Ifyun will be publisher and chairman. The Sun, which took its name from a New York paper published from 1833 to 1950, returned to newsstands under Mr. Lipsky's direction in 2002 and quickly became known for its politically conservative tone. Since The Sun laid off its staff and stopped appearing on newsstands, it has maintained a modest online presence, publishing opinion essays by Mr. Lipsky and his former business associate, Ira Stoll, and freelance contributors. For The Sun's comeback, Mr. Ifyun said he planned to expand the opinion section and hire journalists and editors to cover local and national politics, as well as culture and the arts. New York Times adds 455,000 subscriptions in its third quarter. I was one of those. The New York Times company said on Wednesday it added 455,000 new digital subscriptions in the third quarter, a gain that keeps the publisher on pace to reach its stated goal of 10 million subscriptions by 2025. Of the Times' nearly 8.4 million total subscriptions, 7.6 million are now digital. Roughly 12% of its subscriptions are international, subscription revenue rose 13.8% to $342.6 million from last year. The Times said it expected subscription revenue to increase 12% and digital subscription revenue to go up 25% in the fourth quarter. New digital offerings may bring in more revenue in the years ahead. In addition to moving Wirecutter beyond a paywall during the third quarter, the Times started offering subscriptions to some of its 50 newsletters, which the company has offered free in recent years. Smartmatic sues Newsmax and One America News Network, claiming defamation. Smartmatic, an electronic technology firm that became the target of pro-Trump conspiracy theories about the 2020 presidential race, sued Newsmax and One America News Network on Wednesday for defamation, demanding that conservative cable news networks face jury trials for spreading falsehoods about the company. Newsmax said in a statement on Wednesday it had reported inaccurately on allegations made by well-known public figures, including the president, his advisors, and members of Congress, as well as reporting on Smartmatic's claim in its defense. The company called the Smartmatic suit a clear attempt to squelch the right of a free press. One America News did not return a request for comment. In the two lawsuits filed against Newsmax in Delaware and against One America News in Washington, D.C., Smartmatic says that the networks aired dozens of reports accusing the company of participating in a conspiracy to rig the election against Mr. Trump. In its suit against Newsmax, Smartmatic says the news organization waged a campaign in order to siphon away viewers from its larger rival, Fox. Fox has filed a motion to dismiss the Smartmatic litigation, arguing that Mr. Trump's claim of election fraud were a matter of significant public interest and handled fairly by the cable news channel, Fox News and Fox Business. Mr. Connolly, the Smartmatic lawyer, said the Newsmax and One America News had no evidence to support anything they were saying. Their guests provided them no evidence for what they were saying, and you could couple that with reams of publicly available information contradicting what is being said. One American News and Newsmax said saw their standing rise with conservatives after the election last year, while Fox News rating dropped after it was the first major network to project that Mr. Biden had won the election in Arizona. Spain is facing a loss of a major source of natural gas. Algeria has stopped supplying gas through one of its main pipelines that crosses Morocco, a move that could threaten Spain with reduced supplies or higher prices for natural gas as winter approaches and energy costs are soaring. Morocco has been using Algerian gas to power two electricity plants that are partly operated by Spanish companies. After an emergency meeting in Algiers last week, Spain's Environment and Energy Minister, Teresa Ribera, said that she was confident that Algeria could guarantee that everything works in the most fluid and best manner possible to keep gas supply flowing to Spain. Some analysts are warning that it will be a challenge for Algeria to raise the capacity of the undersea pipeline or charter more liquefied natural gas ships, given that there is a shortage of available vessels. Gonzalo Escribano, an energy expert at the Real Instituto Elcano, a Madrid-based think tank, said that Algeria's pipeline closing could result in Spain paying more for the gas, given the high cost and complicated logistics of shipping liquefied natural gas, but it should not pose a major supply risk ahead of the winter. Despite the latest tensions, he said, Algeria has historically always honored its contracts and political pledges in this field. For Morocco, Mr. Escribano said the situation is much more complicated, both in terms of losing Algerian gas that has fueled its electricity grid and losing the fees that it has received from the gas transiting through the pipeline. How to block your phone from interrupting you. For the hands-free approach, just say, "Okay, Google, open the Digital Wellbeing Center settings." On an Apple device running iOS 15, open the settings icon, scroll to focus, say, "Hey Siri, open my settings works too." On the focus screen, you'll see the old Do Not Disturb setting has moved in, and you have a button to share your settings across other Apple devices, including Macs. You can set a time schedule for each focus category or have it automatically activated by location. For example, your home focus settings pause your Slack notifications and your work emails when you arrive at your apartment. In Android's digital well-being settings, tap Dashboard and set the timers for specific apps. The iOS settings have a separate screen time section where you can set time limits for apps. The iOS 15 focus setting also include a sleep option where you can set up which you can set up just like your work and other focus scenarios. Deere says it won't resume talks after striking workers reject an agreement. One day after workers at the agriculture equipment maker Deere & Company voted down a second contract proposal, the company said Wednesday that the proposal was its best and final offer and had no other plans to resume bargaining. The rejection of the contract by roughly 10,000 workers extended a strike that began in mid-October after workers based primarily in Iowa and Illinois voted down an earlier agreement negotiated by the United Automobile Workers Union. A UAW spokesman said only that the union's negotiating team was continuing to discuss next steps. Mark A. Howes, a senior Deere official, said in a statement Tuesday night that the agreement would have included an investment of an additional $3.5 billion in our employees and by extension our communities. With the rejection of an agreement covering our Midwest facilities, we will execute the next phase of our customer service continuation plan. A statement continued, alluding to Deere's use of salaried employees to run facilities where workers are striking. Chris Larson, a worker at John Deere plant in Ottumwa, Iowa, who was president of his local union until recently, said that he voted in favor of a new agreement after voting to reject the previous one. If we turn down a 20% increase over a 6-year period, substantial gains to our pensions, I'm afraid we would lose that. But Mr. Larson said he still has concerns about the vagueness of the company's commitment to improving its worker incentive plan, and such concerns appear to weigh on his co-workers, 55% of whom voted to reject the new contract. Larry Cohen, a former president of the Communications Workers of America, said the second no vote could indicate that members felt the strike was working and that further gains were possible despite the company's declaration it was finished bargaining. The work stoppage at Deere was part of an uptick in strikes around the country last month that also included more than 1,000 workers at Kellogg and more than 2,000 hospital workers in upstate New York. Fed takes first step toward ending pandemic measures. The Fed is not yet saying that higher rates, a powerful tool that can swiftly slow demand and work to offset inflation, are imminent. For now, the Fed is betting that inflation will fade and the labor market will lure back workers who might be lingering on the sidelines to avoid catching the coronavirus or because they have childcare or other issues that are keeping them at home. The Fed is willing to tolerate a temporary bout of quick inflation as the economy reopens from the pandemic. But if consumers and businesses come to expect persistently higher prices, that could spell trouble. The Fed has said it wants to achieve full employment before raising borrowing costs to cool the economy. And Mr. Powell was clear that the job market has yet to meet that milestone. If the Fed has to lift interest rates to contain inflation before the labor market is healed, it could come at a serious cost. If the Fed slows the economy before they can, it could be harder for those workers to move into new jobs, leaving the economy with less potential and families with fewer paychecks. The WHO grants Covaxin, a COVID vaccine developed in India, emergency authorization. The World Health Organization on Wednesday granted emergency authorization to Covaxin, the first coronavirus vaccine developed in India, and to get the designation providing a major boost for Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who has stressed his intention of making the country's pandemic prevention effort self-reliant. The WHO said Covaxin has a 78% efficacy rate against COVID-19 and should be administered in 2 doses after 4 weeks apart in adults, noting the vaccine's easier storage requirements might be convenient for poor and developing countries. Mr. Modi, who got his first shot of the vaccine in March, said at the Group of 20 summit in Rome last week that his country will be able to produce over 5 billion vaccine doses over the next year to help the world in the fight against the pandemic. Officials in Brazil, where the government had bought doses of Covaxin, had raised questions about the vaccine and were investigating possible irregularities in its contract to buy 20 million shots of Covaxin from India. Covaxin's manufacturer said in a statement on Wednesday that the WHO's validation would help expedite requests from countries seeking to buy the vaccine. The authorization will enable us to contribute to accelerating equitable access of COVID-19 vaccine and the access of our vaccine globally. Young children are lining up for the new wave of COVID vaccines. In Houston, Texas Children's Hospital on Wednesday morning tackled the first of some 35,000 pediatric COVID-19 vaccine appointments, a rush that officials said had been booked in just 5 days. Late Tuesday, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention recommended the Pfizer-BioNTech coronavirus vaccine for children aged 5 through 11. Dr. Zoe Gore, a Kaiser Permanente pediatrician in Roseville, California, said her practice near Sacramento planned to start inoculating younger children next week and had received its first shipment of vaccines on Tuesday. Our pharmacist took a picture and sent it to everyone. In California, which has some 3.5 million children between 5 and 11, nearly a tenth of the state's population, the authorization of pediatric vaccines was met with an almost giddy sense of celebration. New York City-run vaccination sites will begin administering shots to children between the ages of 5 and 11 starting Thursday, and Mayor Bill de Blasio said that every school with students in that age group will offer in-school vaccination for at least one day, beginning on Monday. Maine's top health official, Dr. Nirav Shah, said that he asked every school district in the state to either host a clinic or partner with another site, such as a hospital or a fire department, to offer the vaccine to children. Texas Children's Main Hospital, its 2 community hospitals, and a variety of other sites are now planning to administer about 2,000 pediatric shots a day, officials said. And the last article, central banks around the world are dialing back their pandemic-era support. Britain's annual rate of inflation was 3.1% in September and is expected to peak above 4% in the coming months. In the Eurozone, inflation came at 4.1% in October, matching the highest ever rate of inflation for the bloc. The Bank of England might become the first major central bank to raise rates if it meets investor expectations on Thursday. Rue Bailey, the central bank's top official, said the rate of inflation was concerning and that policymakers needed to prevent high inflation from becoming permanent. But their decision on Thursday is likely to split the 9-person Monetary Policy Committee, as some members haven't expressed as much certainty that rates need to rise. Last week, Christine Lagarde, the president of the bank, said higher inflation and supply chain bottlenecks would last longer than expected in the region, but would eventually ease over the course of 2022. Financial markets were wrong to expect an increase in interest rates next year, she added, because longer-term inflation expectations remain below the ECB's target. And that has been Reading the Times for November 4th, 2021. Reading the Times for November 4th, 2021. My name is Shaz Barrick, yours for the revolution. Signing off.